Alright, so where do I even begin? The whole experience still feels surreal, like a nightmare I can't wake up from. But I guess if I'm going to be honest with myself, and with all of you, it's time to write this down and share it. Maybe someone can learn from my mistake. It all started a few weeks ago when I got that phone call from Sarah. It was a regular Thursday afternoon. Nothing too special. I was just sitting on my couch, scrolling through my phone, when her name popped up on the screen. Sarah's voice always sounded a little too excited, like she just stumbled upon the best idea ever. "Lex, you're not going to believe what I just got invited to," she said, practically bursting through the phone. "A swinger party. And guess what? It's at a hospital." I laughed, thinking she was joking. "A what?" "At a hospital," I repeated, still not sure if I'd heard her right. "No, seriously. I know it sounds wild, but just hear me out," she insisted. "I've been to a few of these things and they're kind of freeing, you know? It's just about having a little fun, no pressure, just letting loose." First, I thought she was out of her mind. A swinger party at a hospital? What kind of twisted joke was that? But knowing Sarah, the idea didn't seem so far-fetched. She was always the one pulling me into crazy situations, always getting me to say yes when I wanted to say no. And somehow, this time I found myself agreeing. "Okay, fine," I said, rolling my eyes. "I'll go. But I'm not doing anything weird, okay?" She practically screamed in excitement, and I could hear her rushing to get ready in the background. I, on the other hand, was questioning every decision that had led me to this point. I mean, how did I go from being a regular girl who just liked watching Netflix to agreeing to go to some bizarre party at a hospital? The more I thought about it, the more ridiculous it sounded. We met in the parking lot, and I immediately felt the tension in the air. The hospital wasn't exactly the place you'd expect for something like this. It felt wrong on so many levels, but there I was, walking alongside Sarah like this was perfectly normal. "So, what exactly happens at one of these things?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. I wasn't sure if I was curious or just trying to distract myself from the creeping sense of dread. I shrugged. "It's hard to explain. You just show up, have a few drinks, talk to people, maybe see where it goes. No expectations, no strings attached." My nerves were through the roof, but I kept walking. We passed through the sterile hallways, the kind that made everything feel even more out of place. The flickering lights above, the harsh smell of antiseptic. Nothing about this screamed party. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into something I had no business being part of. When we finally reached the room, my heart dropped. It was more of a lounge area than anything. There were a handful of people hanging out, but they didn't look like the kind of crowd I'd imagined. They were all standing around, chatting quietly, acting as if they were at a casual get-together, except something about the air was wrong. Energy was off. Sarah seemed completely at ease. She smiled, waved at a few people, and immediately jumped into conversation. But me. I stood there, feeling more and more out of place by the second. I glanced around the room, trying not to make eye contact with anyone. My thoughts were spinning. This was a mistake. I shouldn't have come. What am I even doing here? Then it happened. One of the men, tall and confident, walked right up to me. He smiled, his eyes dark and intense, and I couldn't look away. There was something about him, something magnetic that I couldn't explain. I had barely opened my mouth before he spoke. "You're new here, aren't you?" he asked, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. I nodded, a little too stunned to say anything else. "Well, you'll fit in just fine," he said, his smile widening as if he knew something I didn't. I wanted to say something, ask him what exactly he meant, but I didn't. I just nodded again and looked away. My gut was screaming at me to leave, but I stood frozen in place, trying to play it cool. Sarah, however, was already deep into conversation with someone else. Laughing and flirting like this was just another day. But me. I could feel the walls closing in. My heart was racing, my skin cold, but I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. It was like everything had shifted, and I was caught in the undertow of something I didn't fully understand. As I stood there, frozen in place, I could hear the murmur of voices around me, the quiet clinking of glasses, the occasional laugh that rang through the room. But none of it made me feel at ease. It felt like everyone was in on some secret, and I was the last to find out. I tried to calm myself, reminding myself that this was supposed to be fun, a way to break out of my usual routine. But deep down something felt off. Then, Sarah turned back to me with a big grin plastered on her face. "Lex, you're just standing there. Come on, join in. It's not like you're gonna regret it." Her eyes sparkled with excitement, and for a moment I could see the thrill in her face. But something about her eagerness only made me feel more uncomfortable. I wasn't sure if I was ready for whatever she was suggesting. The man who had spoken to me earlier, let's call him Mark, was still watching me. He was standing at the other side of the room now, sipping on a drink. His gaze locked on me in a way that made my skin crawl. I couldn't tell if he was sizing me up or if he was just being friendly, but I didn't want to find out. I turned away, trying to focus on the room around me, but my eyes kept darting back to him. As I tried to gather my thoughts, I overheard some of the others talking. They were laughing, exchanging playful comments that sounded far too intimate for my liking. One woman, dressed in a long, flowing black dress, whispered to her friend, "You've got to be careful. Not everyone here plays by the same rules." It was a throwaway comment, but it stuck with me. Something about it felt like a warning, though I couldn't tell what exactly I was being warned about. I glanced at Sarah again, but she was too deep in conversation with someone else to notice how unsettled I was. I needed some air. I excused myself and stepped outside the room, the cool hallway offering a brief moment of relief. My mind was racing. I thought about turning around, just walking out and leaving Sarah behind. But the thought of her being alone in this environment made me hesitate. We came together, and I wasn't about to leave her here. I wasn't sure what kind of trouble she could get herself into. So I walked back into the room, hoping to at least find a drink to calm my nerves. But as I re-entered, the energy had shifted. The room felt hotter now, suffocating almost, like the air had become thick with anticipation. People were starting to pair off, talking more closely, touching each other more intimately. The once casual atmosphere now felt charged, like a pressure building that I couldn't escape. "Lex, hey!" Sarah called out from across the room, waving me over with an enthusiastic smile. She looked like she was having the time of her life, her face flushed with excitement. I walked over, trying to smile back. But before I could even say a word, she pulled me into a conversation with a couple I had never seen before. The woman, tall with long blonde hair and wearing a red dress that barely reached her thighs, smiled at me as though we were already friends. "Lex, right?" she said, her voice smooth and confident. "You look a little lost, hon." "Don't worry, everyone feels that way at first." I gave a tight smile, nodding. "Yeah, it's a lot to take in." She raised an eyebrow. "You'll get used to it. In fact, I think you're gonna enjoy tonight more than you think." At that moment I felt my stomach tighten. Something about her tone, her knowing smile, made me feel like I was being pulled into something much deeper than I had bargained for. And that's when I saw Mark again. His eyes fixed on me, a faint grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. I quickly looked away, my heart racing. Suddenly, I felt a hand on my arm. I looked up to see the man I had been trying to avoid, the one who had approached me earlier. "Mark, you okay?" he asked, his voice low. There was something in his gaze now, something more intense, as if he could see right through me. I pulled my arm back, taking a step back. "Yeah, just taking it all in." "Right," he said, smiling knowingly. "It's a lot to process. But I promise you, once you let go, you'll have a great time." He stepped closer, and I instinctively took another step back. I could feel the weight of his presence. It wasn't the kind of attention I wanted, but there was no denying that it felt like I was being drawn into something I couldn't control. And that, more than anything, made me want to run. Before I could react, Sarah turned back to me, her eyes shining. "You've got to come join us, Lex. Trust me. It's going to be fun." I looked at her, then at Mark, and then at the crowd around us, now visibly more relaxed, more comfortable. The tension in the room felt almost palpable, and I knew deep down that I wasn't ready for whatever was about to happen next. I took a deep breath. Sarah, I started, my voice shaking slightly. I don't think I'm cut out for this. Sarah's smile faltered for a second, but she quickly regained her composure. Don't worry, Lex. It's just a party. Nothing to be afraid of. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary party. It was something darker, something I wasn't prepared for. And that's when I knew. This was my chance to walk away before things went too far. Okay, so here I was, standing in the middle of what I can only describe as the most awkward situation of my life. I could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on me. I wasn't used to this. I wasn't used to being the center of attention, especially not in this weird, suffocating environment. And yet there I was. Sarah had already started talking to someone else, her attention no longer on me, which should have been a relief. But instead I felt more alone than ever. The crowd around me had grown, and it wasn't the kind of gathering you'd find at a normal party. People were clustered in groups, some talking in low, conspiratorial tones, while others moved from person to person, like they were part of some unspoken ritual. It felt like I was watching a play I didn't understand, where I had no script and no idea what was coming next. Mark, of course, had followed me. I could feel his presence looming just behind me. I didn't want to turn around and face him, but I couldn't help it. There he was, standing way too close, just watching. Felt like he was waiting for something, waiting for me to make a move, or maybe just waiting for me to crack under the pressure. His eyes never left me, and it made my stomach twist in knots. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice smooth as silk. I forced myself to nod, though my nerves were still shot. "Yeah, I'm good, just getting used to everything." He smiled, a smile that wasn't reassuring at all. "That's the thing about these parties, Lex. You don't have to get used to it. You just have to let go. Let go." Those words echoed in my head like some kind of ominous warning. What was he really saying? Was he pushing me into something I wasn't ready for? Because at that moment, I knew I didn't want to let go. I wanted to grab hold of the situation, to pull myself out of this nightmare before it went any further. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself that maybe I was just overthinking it. But it was hard not to notice how everyone around me seemed to have a connection with someone else. How the room buzzed with a kind of energy I didn't understand. The people who had started off as strangers now seemed too comfortable with each other. They were touching, whispering, exchanging looks that said a lot more than words ever could. I glanced over at Sarah again. She was laughing, her face glowing, completely at ease in a way that I could never pull off. She caught my eye and waved me over to join her group, a group that now included a man I didn't recognize, and a woman who was dressed in something that barely passed as clothing. The way they looked at me made me feel like I was the odd one out, like I was somehow failing the test, just by standing there, fully clothed, holding a drink in my hand like it was a life preserver. "You coming over?" Sarah asked, her voice light but with that edge of insistence that I'd come to know. She didn't understand why I was hesitating. Why should I be? It was just a party, right? But as I walked over to her, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. Sarah was smiling, yes, but her smile didn't reach her eyes anymore. The energy in the room had shifted again. People weren't just mingling, they were moving. There was a rhythm to the place now, a kind of slow, seductive pulse that I wasn't sure I was ready to follow. "Lex, you okay?" Sarah asked as I joined them. She was looking at me, really looking at me with a sort of curiosity, like she was waiting for me to give in. I smiled weakly. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just still figuring this out." "Don't overthink it," she said, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Just have fun. You deserve it. Trust me, you're gonna love it here. It's all about letting go of the walls you've built up." Letting go. Again, those words haunted me. And for the first time I could see it in her eyes. She wasn't just having fun. She was lost in it, caught in whatever this world was. I didn't want to be here anymore. I didn't want to be caught in this web. I glanced back at Mark. He was still watching me. It wasn't just casual interest now. Felt like he was waiting for something specific, something that only he could understand. His grin had faded, and there was something colder about his expression now. as if I was either going to join in or not. And that's when I realized I didn't belong here. Not with Sarah, not with these people. I wanted out. I needed out. I think I'm going to head home, I said abruptly, my voice shaking slightly. Sarah's face fell, her expression softening. What? Why? We're just getting started. I shook my head, forcing a smile. I just don't think this is for me, Sarah. I'm sorry. She opened her mouth to protest, but then stopped herself. I could see the disappointment in her eyes, but I couldn't stay. I couldn't let myself get pulled into whatever strange game they were playing here. This wasn't me. I turned and walked toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. Every step felt like a weight I couldn't carry. It was as if the room itself was trying to hold me back, pulling me into its orbit, telling me that I couldn't leave. But I didn't care. I was done. I needed to get out of there before anything else happened, before I made a decision I couldn't undo. I pushed the door open and stepped into the hallway. I didn't look back. I stepped into the cold hallway, trying to take steady breaths. My heart was still pounding, and I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I hadn't realized how tightly wound I'd become, how much tension had been building inside of me. But now that I was outside that room, it felt like a wave of relief washed over me, even though I was still shaking. As I made my way to the exit, my thoughts were racing. What the hell had I just walked into? How did things go so wrong so quickly? All I wanted was to have a little fun, to try something different, but that's not what I had found. No, I had walked into a world that wasn't meant for me, and I knew that now. I pushed open the doors of the hospital, stepping into the fresh air, trying to calm myself. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out, seeing a text from Sarah. Where did you go? I was just getting started. Come back. I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering over the reply. Part of me wanted to explain everything to her, to tell her how uncomfortable I was, how out of place I felt. But I didn't know if she'd understand. It felt like she was already lost in this world, and I was just an outsider looking in. Instead of replying, I put the phone back in my pocket and started walking toward my car. I had to get out of there. The longer I stayed, the more I felt like I was going to be pulled back in, like the party's strange, magnetic pull would drag me back to where I didn't want to be. The drive home felt like a blur. The streets seemed to stretch on forever, and the lights blurred together in my peripheral vision. I didn't care about the traffic or the other cars on the road. I just needed to get home, to feel safe again, to feel normal again. When I finally reached my apartment, I rushed inside, locking the door behind me like I was trying to keep out the shadows that had followed me. I sank onto my couch, still breathing heavily, still trying to shake the feeling of dread that had followed me all the way home. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from Sarah. I stared at it for a moment, unsure what to do. Part of me wanted to pick up, to explain myself, to make sure she didn't feel like I was abandoning her. But another part of me just wanted silence. I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't want to hear about how great the party had been for her, or how I was missing out. I wasn't ready to deal with that. I let the phone ring until it went to voicemail. Then I threw it onto the table and buried my face in my hands. What had I done? How had I let myself get talked into something so bizarre? The night had started with curiosity, with the idea of stepping outside my comfort zone. But instead I had learned a valuable lesson. There are some things you just can't unsee. Some worlds that aren't meant for you, no matter how much you try to fit in. I stayed up that night, my thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and regret. The whole experience felt like a fever dream, one that I'd never want to revisit. I kept asking myself if I had done the right thing by leaving. But deep down I knew I had. Sometimes walking away is the bravest thing you can do. I hadn't let myself get swept up in something I wasn't ready for, and for that I was proud of myself.